Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thanks for being here this morning. For Tyler and Leslie, our subject this year is the question that Christ asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And we are using a book by Metropolitan Hilarion. It's a 6-volume series. It's called Jesus Christ, His Life and Teaching. And we are at the very beginning of the gospel, defining who Jesus is through the sources of the gospels and the epistles. So we've gone through all of the gospels and the epistles of Paul. And this week, we're going to start with chapter 3, looking at Jesus as the Son of Man. And as we know, Jesus was perfect God and perfect man. And as the Son of Man, he originated from a people and a country in human history. And the people he belonged to originated with the biblical patriarch Abraham. Abraham was originally living in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in the southern part of Babylonia at that time, just off the coast of the Persian Gulf. It's in present-day Iraq. And as we know from the book of Genesis, God commanded Abraham to leave the land of his family, his fathers, and set off to the land of Canaan, which was on the eastern Mediterranean coast. And this also was repeated by the proto-martyr Stephen in the book of Acts when he was on trial by the Sanhedrin. So in both Genesis 12 and Acts 7, we hear the story of Abraham. First, he arrives in the city of Haran, which is in present-day southern Turkey. And then he goes to a place in Canaan called Shechem, where God promised him the land. It's from this time that the settlement of the land of Canaan by Abraham and his descendants began. And they received the name of the people of Israel, which came from the name of Abraham's grandson Jacob, to whom God gave the new name Israel. And in this icon, we see Abraham on the left, his son Isaac in the middle, and Jacob to the right. And Jacob is holding an icon from the coming Messiah of Christ. And we have to understand that Abraham obviously had more than one son, but the lineage of Jesus Christ as a human being was through Isaac. And then Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. And it is through Jacob that the Christ arose. And so that's why we have Jacob holding the smaller icon of Christ in his hand.
Charlie?
Yes, Sam.
Just one comment. It's something interesting. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they said the book of Matthew starts with the genealogy with Abraham, but the book of Luke starts with Adam. And it's because one of them starts with the genealogy of faith, and the other is the genealogy of Jesus.
Excellent, Sam. That's exactly it. And so that's why they have 2 genealogies, but Matthew is talking about the human lineage of Christ, and Luke is talking about his divine. Actually, he goes back to Adam, and Adam as the Son of God, a creation of God. But yeah, thank you, Sam, for that information. So the people of Israel, for the people of Israel, this was the Holy Land belonging to God himself, by the way. And I emphasize those words because there's a lot of controversy over who owns the land. But in fact, it was God himself who owns the land. They looked upon it as as God's inheritance and God's estate. And this is spoken of in both books of Samuel and Jeremiah as well. And so this is God's land, who told Abraham to settle there, and he was going to establish his people there in order to have a people prepared for the Messiah, and then to actually produce the Messiah in human form by natural means through the Theotokos. And in fact, God himself addresses the people of Israel in the book of Leviticus, and he says, "For this is my land, you are strangers and sojourners with me." So it's God's land. These people are there to settle it for God in his name. I want you to look at those words, strangers and sojourners, and keep those in mind, because today in the epistle, Paul is addressing the Ephesians, and he says in the epistle, because of Jesus Christ, we are no longer strangers and sojourners, but Christ has given us the freedom to now live in the heavenly Jerusalem, in the promised land that is in heaven. So keep those in mind when you hear the epistle today, that it started out on earth, but we end up in heaven with the Lord. By the way, before I forget, we're going to be meeting in this room from now on, I think, unless we outgrow it, and no class next week. Next Sunday is number one, the ordination of Archdeacon David, and also it's a Thanksgiving break. So no class next week. 2 weeks from today, we'll meet again. So by the time Abraham arrived in the promised land, it was already densely populated by Canaanites, who were descendants of the son of Noah, Ham, and Ham's son was Canaan. So they settled that land. And they lived there for a number of years, but as a result of prolonged famine, the children of Abraham, of Isaac and Jacob, had to relocate to Egypt. And the book of Genesis ends with the people of Israel living in Egypt. And then the next book, the Old Testament, the book of Exodus, is dedicated to the return of the people of Israel from Egypt. The main hero of Exodus is Moses, who led the people of Israel out of their bondage in Egypt. So we know this from Old Testament history. It's pretty familiar to us. So Abraham is the, quote, hero of Genesis. Moses is the hero of Exodus. Now, in bringing out the people of Israel from Egypt, it is more than just crossing the Red Sea and coming into the land of Canaan. God here is actually creating a people for himself, and not just a group of Hebrews. And this is the creation of Israel. And this is something I learned this summer at a class I took from St. Vladimir Seminary. So before the Hebrews became the sons of Israel, they were vigorous and prolific, but unformed. And we know from the book of Exodus in the first chapter, it says that the Hebrews were very reproductive, and they formed a large group, a minority within the Egyptian country. Once they passed through the Red Sea, that marked the birth of Israel from the chaos of the waters, almost as though God was recreating man as he did in Genesis. There was the chaos of the waters initially, and then the Spirit hovered over the waters, and we had the creation. Now, through these waters of the Red Sea, a birth of this nation as a cohesive group occurs. So by defeating Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt, God extracts Israel, a people for himself, literally recreating this people out of Egypt, creatio ex Egypto. And as we know from the Old Testament, Israel journeys from the Red Sea to the Sinai, but this is now still not the promised land. And there on Sinai, Moses receives the commandments from God. And Israel wanders through the Sinai wilderness for 40 years and then comes to the promised land. And in the book of Exodus, the Lord, the author says, you brought them in and planted them on the mountain of your own possession, the place, O Lord, that you made your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, that your hands have established. As we said, the promised land was God's land. It was his abode. It belonged to him. So he plants them in the promised land. What completes the creation of this Israel, this new people, is the establishment of Israel as a priestly kingdom that cultivates true worship. So not only are they now a new creation, but they're a priestly kingdom. And it says in Exodus, Moses says, you shall be unto me, God, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And if that sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly what Peter said to the new Christians in his epistle. And he says, you are a holy priesthood, a holy nation. So the people of Israel that God created after the Exodus from Egypt is now the church. And the church is the new Israel, the Israel of God. So it's a continuum, if you can see that, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. God creates this new people for himself, and that becomes the church, and that's who we are now. But at Sinai, the Israelites have to return to Eden. But how? Remember, the first man was created on earth, and then he was planted in Eden. Well, the new Eden is actually the tabernacle that the Lord commanded Moses and the Israelites to make. And that tabernacle was where God dwelt with the Israelites, as you remember. And he told them how to build it, exactly the proportions, what to put inside it. And in this schematic here, these are the tribes of Israel around the tabernacle, and that becomes the new Eden. As man was created and planted in the original Garden of Eden, now the new creation is planted in the new Eden. And it says in Exodus, you shall make me a sanctuary. There's chairs here. And there's some more chairs here as well.
Apparently was the tabernacle in Jerusalem, at modern day Jerusalem.
It eventually ended up in Jerusalem, and then it also ended up being the temple, the prototype of the temple.
Hey, Charlie.
Yes, great.
Not to be cynical.
Yeah.
But didn't God have the same problem in the new Eden that he did in the old Eden?
That's correct.
This was a new creation, but
Yes. Unfortunately, as we'll see later, the new creation, Israel, did fall away from God. And he had to admonish them several times. And in fact, they were taken away. I'm sorry, but I guess we're outgrowing our room here.
That's our old.
good problem.
So
Here it comes.
there we go.
Charlie, you're just growing in popularity. We're just.
Well, I'm glad. Thank you everyone for being here. Just to catch up those who just came in. We're talking about Jesus, obviously, as the beginnings of the gospel. And we're talking about his origins as the Son of Man. So after the Israelites wandered through the desert for 40 years, they come to the original promised land where Abraham and his descendants were first settled. Now, Moses has died by this time, and so the next leader of the Israelites is called Joshua, as we know him, and he's followed by a group of judges. The second time Abraham's descendants enter into the promised land after the Exodus from Egypt around the 15th century BC. This was accompanied by numerous wars, as we hear in the book of Joshua and Judges. The first time Abraham settled there, it was peaceful. The second time, there was a lot of strife because of two things. One is the Canaanites who lived there had heard about what happened to Pharaoh's country in the crossing of the Red Sea. And so the fear of these Israelites was there with the Canaanites. They were afraid of these people that were coming in. Some of them were peaceful and allowed the Israelites to come in and resettle. Some of them were very hostile. And so without going into a lot of details, they kind of had to fight their way back into the land of Canaan. And we have to understand here that God was leading Israel back into the promised land, into his land, as we said before. And we have this passage from the book of Joshua. Now, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a sword drawn in his hand. Joshua approached him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" In the tradition of the church, this figure, this one with the sword, is acknowledged to be the Archangel Michael. And he is now the commander of the army of Israel coming into the land. So this is God's will that they come back in here. He says, "I'm neither. I have come now as commander of the Lord's army." Joshua then falls down in reverence and asks him, "What does my Lord have to say to his servant?" And the Archangel Michael says, "The commander of the Lord's army replied, 'Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy.'" Similar to what Moses heard at the burning bush. And so Joshua did so. Now in this icon, we also see they're outside the gates of the walls of Jericho. That's the Ark of the Covenant, covered in gold, carried by the priests. And as God commanded Joshua, have this ark carried before you wherever you go when you are now settling into this land. And as we know from the Old Testament, Jericho's walls fell and the Israelites now occupied slowly but surely the land of Canaan. Now, the people of Israel originally had no government. For a time, they were ruled by judges, that is, clan leaders, and the book of Judges is dedicated to this period. Interestingly enough, it wasn't just men who led. There were judges. One of the most famous is Deborah. This is her icon here, who was one of the clan leaders of one of the tribes of Israel, and she led Israel for a number of years. There were 13 judges, 12 raised up by God, and one usurper. His name was Abimelech, and he tried to make himself a king. And if you read the book of Judges, he fails miserably. But the other 12 judges were raised up by God and were blessed by him to lead the Israelites. A couple of the other More famous judges were Gideon and Samson. Samson actually was a judge of Israel as well. He was from the tribe of Dan. So Israel was a theocracy. It was led by God. The judges were not kings, but deputies of God sent to save the people from 7 different apostasies. So Greg, right from the beginning, they started to apostatize. What they were doing was starting to worship some of the Canaanite gods in the land of Israel, or I'm sorry, in the promised land. The office was not continual, rather judges who were raised up as oppressive circumstances required. So this is the next phase of the people of God. Any questions so far? The next period we come to is the period of kings. Eventually, the Israelites looked around and said, all these other people have kings for them. Why can't we have a king? So they implored their leaders that we want a king. So around the year 1030 BC, the prophet Samuel anointed Saul as king. And from this time, the story are reflected in the 2 books of Samuel, 2 books of Kings, and the book of Chronicles begins. So you read the Old Testament, it's just really a series of stories about all of these kings that go on. Now, Saul failed in his kingship. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he was replaced by David. The second king of the Israelites was David, who shortly after being anointed as king, around 30 years after Saul, took Jerusalem and made it his capital of the United Kingdom of Israel. So all 12 tribes of Israel united under David in a single kingdom. Now, David is of the tribe of Judah, and Jacob, the father of all of the patriarchs, had prophesied that the Messiah would come from the tribe of Judah. So again, we're talking about the lineage and the human lineage of Jesus Christ as the Son of Man. And so now the kingship comes to the tribe of Judah, not from the tribe of Benjamin, but Judah. And that's where David comes in. David entered history of the Israelites as the most successful leader. The political and cultural flowering of Israel is associated with his name. Also, he is known as a prophet and a poet, and as we know, he wrote most of the Psalms that we read in the Psalter. His son Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem. Prior to the temple being built, the tabernacle was a mobile temple, if you will. It went with the people of Israel through the Sinai into the land of Canaan. And it wasn't until Solomon that they built a permanent tabernacle, so to speak. They took the same proportions and design and now made it a solid building. The church that we have is based on the tabernacle and the temple of the Old Testament. And so when we see the nave and the sanctuary, it is exactly in the same design as the original tabernacle. And so you can see the continuity of the people of Israel of the Old Testament and now the New Testament church as the new Israel. Well, as with any human nature, the kingdom becomes divided. After the death of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel divides into 2. The kingdoms one is called Israel, one is called Judah. Of the 12 tribes, 2 of them settled around Jerusalem, Judah and Benjamin. The other 10 settled in the northern part of that area, around the area we now know as Samaria and Galilee. So 10 and 2. And of course, like any brothers and families, they fought with each other, and so their boundaries changed constantly. Now, during this time also, the people of Israel and Judah tended to get away from God, their God, and they started to worship Baal and other pagan gods. And as a result of that, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians destroyed the first temple in Jerusalem and led most of the tribe of Judah away into captivity around the year 586. 130 years earlier, the Assyrians did the same thing to the northern kingdom. So both were exiled out for almost 200 years. So they had the promised land and they lost it because of their apostasy. About 539 BC, the King Cyrus of Persia conquered the Babylonians, and he actually allowed the people of Israel to return to the land of Canaan, to the land where they were promised. And they actually restored the temple. It was constructed and completed at around 516 BC. So now we have the second temple. Meanwhile, the territory, which was the former Israel and Judah, became basically provinces of the Persian Empire. They're the overlords here at this point, and they're called Judah and Samaria. We become familiar with these names now as we come closer to the New Testament era. Around this time, something called synagogues were constructed. But prior to this, there were no synagogues outside of Jerusalem. There was just the temple. The synagogues were built throughout these territories, Judah, Galilee, and Samaria. They were assembly houses, kind of like where people would come and read the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the books of the prophets, and they would discuss them. Bible studies, essentially.
Charlotte's class.
Yeah, that's what they did. They came, they read, and they talked about it. At the same time, they had common prayer, which kind of bore the nature of public worship, and they came to the synagogues on the Sabbath day. So if you weren't in Jerusalem, you couldn't go to the temple. So you went to these synagogues in order to gather. And the Gospels describe many instances of Jesus visiting the synagogues. And when we read the New Testament Gospels, these are some of the instances where that happens. One of the most famous is the icon that we have here, and that's when Jesus, when he first starts his ministry, comes to Nazareth, where he was born and raised, and goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and it's his turn to read from the prophecy of Isaiah. They hand him the scroll, he opens it, and the reading is, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, on account of which he anointed me. He has sent me to preach the good tidings to the poor." And then it reads several other things. The blind will see, the lame will walk, the dead will be raised. He closes the scroll, gives it back to the attendant, sits down, everybody's looking at him. And he says, "In the hearing of this prophecy, it is fulfilled in me." It's sort of like me saying, "I'm the Messiah." And they were outraged. They said, "You're not the Messiah. You're the son of the carpenter. How can you be the Messiah?" And they were so outraged, they were ready to kill him. The gospel says they took him to the edge of a cliff, ready to throw him off. And obviously this wasn't the time for him to die. And he walks away from that.
How old was he then?
About 30. About 30. This is the very beginning of his ministry. So the synagogues were very popular. Jesus Christ did many of his miracles in synagogues. He healed the man with a withered hand. Several other healings were done in the synagogues. So going back to the Old Testament times, now even though there were synagogues throughout the whole area, the Jerusalem temple was still the center of the spiritual life of the Jewish people. And the head of the spiritual life was the high priest. He was what we would call our patriarch, if you will. And he conducted his ministry in the temple. It was hereditary. It began with Aaron, who was Moses' brother. And so actually it began on Mount Sinai, right after the law was given. And it was passed on from father to son throughout all his descendants. So you could only be a priest if you were of the line of Aaron and they were of the tribe of Levi. So you had the priestly line, and then the Levites were what we would consider as deacons. They assisted the priests in the temple in the liturgical sense. The high priests were also part of by the way, it was gone during the captivity in Babylon. It was restored when they got back to the land of Canaan. And not only was the high priest the high liturgical officer, but he was also the highest judicial officer. And he was part of what they call the Sanhedrin, which was basically the Supreme Court of that time. And it was modeled on the Council of 70 elders that Moses had gathered
Charlie,
at the Lord's command.
at this time, were they still under rule of Persia, or?
Yeah,
So they didn't have a king at the time.
no, they do.
They do.
They do have kings. They have kings that ruled under the Persian overlords.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so they still had kings.
So was there separation of church and state at this time, or how was the relationship between the king and the high priest?
The king was the political ruler. The high priest was the spiritual head of the nation.
Okay. But Persia was still over.
Persia was still over them.
Okay.
And this, yeah.
Just back to what he says, it's kind of like, if you think about like Saul and first king,
David.
no, not David, before David, Saul.
Saul and Samuel.
Saul, yeah, because like remember Saul tried to do the high priestly job and making a sacrifice and told him to come over. Like, what are you doing? You've lost your kingship. So,
Right, a good point. Yeah, the king was the political leader, and then Samuel was the religious leader at that time. And then the priests were still the priests of the line of Aaron. And so there was no crossover. Like you said, Saul couldn't do that. So both the high priest and the Sanhedrin, they were the aristocracy. They were the 1%. Then along came the Greeks, Alexander the Great. He conquered the Persians. Okay, and so now Alexander the Great in 332 BC, he comes along, he takes Judah and Samaria. And this is when the Jews and the Samaritans really start to fight with each other. Why? Because Alexander said to the Samaritans, you can build a temple if you want in the city of Gerizim, on Mount Gerizim, as opposed to the temple of Jerusalem, which remained the center for the Jews' liturgical life. So now you have two competing religious centers. And that's why the Jews and the Samaritans had such a problem with each other.
The Samaritans also were Jews, though, right? No.
Samaritans that's a good point. They were a mixed group. When they came back from their exile, a lot of Assyrians came with them and they intermarried with the Assyrians. When Judah came back, they kind of stayed to themselves. So they were a less mixed group of people. They were a very homogeneous group.
Did they worship the same God?
Yes, yes. Although the Samaritans kind of every now and then would shovel off into the pagan side a little bit. So they had their issues with them. And so thanks to Alexander's policy of tolerance, the Jews were dispersed throughout the various cities of the empire, particularly Alexandria and Antioch. Okay, and so they were able to now spread out outside of Judea and Samaria. Okay, and so they went there, and the predominant language eventually became Greek, because Greek was such a the Alexandrian empire was so popular and so powerful, I should say. So the majority of the Jews arose, and their main language was Greek. And it was in those Jews that the Greek translation of the Bible was produced in Alexandria around 282 BC. Eventually, the Jews that lived in the Greek cities didn't understand the Hebrew anymore. And so they said, we can't read the Old Testament. So a group of 70 scholars were assembled to translate the Bible, Hebrew Bible, into Greek, so that the Jews could still practice their religion. One of those 70, in the tradition of the church, is the man we see in the icon here, Simeon, the God receiver. Okay, he was one of the 70. We'll talk about him a little bit. He's commemorated in our church calendar on February 3rd. When Jesus was presented to the temple after 40 days after his birth, Simeon is there. Simeon was led by the Holy Spirit to go to the temple on this particular day. And Simeon was known as a very old man, probably the oldest man in the kingdom, maybe in the world. And so during the reign of the Egyptian Emperor Ptolemy, as we said, he was chosen as one of the 70 to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. While he's translating the Bible, he's translating the book of Isaiah. He comes along the passage that says, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Simeon is translating and he's looking at this passage and he's going, wait a minute, this can't be. This is the mistake. So he takes the knife out to cut the word virgin out of the manuscript and replace it with the words young woman. Is he saying to himself, no, this cannot be mistakes. Whoever wrote this is wrong. And he's just about to do that. At that moment, an angel of the Lord appears to Simeon and restrains him from this intention, explaining to him that the prophecy is true, that it was correctly written. The virgin will bear a son. Moreover, the angel says to Simeon that you're going to be convinced of this personally, for according to the will of God, you would not die until you see the Messiah born of the Virgin. And so, as we learn in the gospel, the child Jesus is brought to him. He carries him in his arms, understands that this is the Christ. And what does he say? His famous, Lord, now let thy servant depart this life in peace, according to your word, according to the pages. Because my eyes have seen your salvation, etc. So you see the connection here now between the Old Testament and New Testament. And that's why Simeon was so old, because he was not allowed to die until he saw the Christ.
How did Jews at that time reconcile this with, like, obviously they don't believe in Christ, or many of them did not, because Simeon would have been a Jew, right?
Yeah.
And so would they just say the guy's crazy? I mean, he made up this apparition in his mind, and he died without. That was the
Kind of what you're
party
saying.
line. Yeah.
Probably what you're saying. You know, this old crazy guy. Now, see that? Now, don't forget though, Anna, the prophetess, was also there to reinforce his prophecy and the truth of this. So they couldn't, maybe they could, consider him a, crazy old guy, but now there's also this pious widow who was also spent her life in the temple in prayer. So we have two witnesses to the same event.
And the Old Testament said it,
And the Old Testament said,
and they knew their scripture, they knew.
that's right.
Do we have a perspective of how old Simeon was?
I'm going to say if the Septuagint was written in around the 280s BC, and this is now, let's say, 3 or 4 AD. So he's about 250 plus years old. Wow. Yeah. That's why I say he's probably the oldest man in the world at that time. And we know from earlier Old Testament that, obviously Adam and his descendants lived 900,000 years, etc. But now we have one who is extremely old for that time. Now, during this period of time, going back to the Old Testament now, there occurs a Maccabean revolt. Even though Alexander was very tolerant, some of his successors were not. And one of them was the Seleucids, who were trying to impose Hellenistic worship on the Jewish people. And so around the 2nd century BC, there was a lot of uprisings, and Judah Maccabeus arose around 166 BC, and he led a revolt against the Seleucid dynasty, against trying to Hellenize their religion. So for the next 100 years, the Jews struggled against the Seleucids to try to gain their independence, but in the process, a lot of the clans fought each other as well. Family fights are terrible, and these groups were no different than anyone else. I want to introduce another interesting group of people during this time, and these are the 7 holy Maccabean martyrs, and we commemorate them on August 1st in our calendar. So during this time, the 7 holy Maccabean martyrs, their names are here: Abim, Antonius, Urias, Eleazar, Eusebianus, Elymas, and Marcellus. Those are the 7 children, and their mother, Solomonia. And then they had a teacher also named Eleazar, and they suffered in the year 166 BC under a very impious Syrian king named Antiochus Epiphanes IV.
Sounds like Orthodox doctrine.
Yeah, his father was named Antioch, and that's who he named the city after, the city of Antioch. And that's where he had the seat of his kingdom, this king. And he loved pagan worship, loved Hellenistic customs, and he hated Jewish customs, and he held them in contempt. So he did everything possible to turn the people away from the law of Moses and from their covenant with God. He actually desecrated the temple in Jerusalem and placed a statue of Zeus in there and forced the Jews to worship it. And of course, he used more than just verbal. He also used force to people to turn away from God. So many people abandoned the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but there were those who continued to believe that the Savior would come. And some of them were these Maccabean children. Their 90-year-old elder, scribe Eleazar, was brought to trial for his faithfulness, and he was tortured, and he died in Jerusalem. The others, the disciples of his Eleazar, the 7 Maccabee brothers and their mother, were taken to Antioch by that king, and they were forced to not only worship the pagan gods, but to eat pork. And that was forbidden by the law. And they said, no, we're not going to do it. In fact, the eldest brother said, we would rather die than break the law. And so the eldest brother was tortured severely, and he eventually died. And the next 5 brothers were also tortured and killed. And finally, King Antiochus says to their mother, look, let the boy worship the gods and I'll save him, okay? And she told her youngest son, be brave, have courage, and don't give in. And in fact, the young child was did not agree to that. He upbraided the king. He was tortured and killed as well. And the mother then stood over their bodies, raised her hands in prayer to the Lord, and she died as well. So we commemorate these 7 Maccabean martyrs, their mother and their teacher, as predecessors of the later Christian martyrs who refused to give up their Christian faith in the face of pagan oppression. Okay. And in fact, the death of these martyrs inspired Judah Maccabeus to revolt against Antiochus, and he eventually drove him out and gained victory and purified the temple in Jerusalem. And so he threw down the altars of pagans as well that were set up all throughout the area of Judea and Samaria. And in fact, the Feast of Hanukkah commemorates, the Jewish Feast of Hanukkah commemorates this Maccabean restoration. And they commemorate these martyrs as well. So, and in fact, many of the church fathers wrote sermons regarding these martyrs. St. John Chrysostom, St. Cyprian of Carthage, Ambrose of Milan, Gregory of Nazianzus, all preached about these martyrs. And then finally, we have the period of Roman rule. So around 63 BC, the Roman Emperor Pompey entered Jerusalem at the request of the Maccabeans. The Maccabeans had thrown off Greek rule, but again, they were fighting with each other. So they asked the Romans to come in and settle our disputes, please. And so the Romans took over. And they placed Herod the Great in around 37 BC to become ruler of the kingdom of Israel. Now, 2 things about Herod. Number 1, he wasn't great, even though he's called great. He was a murderer, mass murderer, killed 14,000 children. And number 2, he wasn't of the tribe of Judah. He wasn't even a Jew. He was from the kingdom of Idumea. He was an Edomite. But the Romans were smart. They placed him there as king so that he could keep the Jews in line for them, and also kind of stir up a little resentment against him to keep the heat off of the Romans. Okay, so Herod was not a legitimate king in the eyes of the Jews. This is where the events of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke start to unfold. Okay, now we're starting to come into the New Testament period. And again, we're talking about Jesus as the Son of Man. This is where he starts to come into the picture. And again, as we said, Herod was placed there as a sort of a satellite king. Herod dies around 4 BC, and his dominion is divided between 4 sons. Herod Archelaus is one of them. He is over Judea, Idumea, and Samaria. Herod Antipas is over Galilee and Perea. His son Philip the Tetrarch is over a number of other regions, who is, in fact, the husband of Herodias, of our infamous fame. And he is also the father, by the way, of Salome, the one that dances for Herod Antipas. And then Herod Antipas is over Galilee. And then the rest of the kingdom goes to Herod's sister Salome. So a weird family here. They have a lot of same names. And finally, one of the sons, Herod Archelaus, is sent into exile. That part of the kingdom, Judea, Idumea, and Samaria, is now ruled directly by the emperor through Roman prefects, the 5th of which is Pontius Pilate. So you see how some of these characters are starting to fall into place in our story of the origins of Jesus Christ.
Who was the king when after Jesus was born, and he had all the kids killed? Who was that?
That was Herod the Great.
Oh.
And then now,
Too many Herods involved.
yeah, a lot of Herods. now that Jesus is an adult, Herod Antipas is the quote king over Galilee, which is where Jesus spends most of his ministry and time. And when he goes into Judea, the ruler of that part of it is Pontius Pilate. So you have Herod in Galilee, Herod Antipas in Galilee, you have Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem and that area. Okay,
So there's a lot of guys named Herod, but there's nobody named Pontius Pilate other than that one guy.
yeah, that's correct.
It's a pretty bad name to have, I guess, isn't it?
Herod Antipas,
Pontius Pilate was a Roman though, right?
Roman, that's right, he's a Roman prefect, he's ruling in place of the emperor around that area. Herod Antipas is the one who is retains his territory. He's still sort of the nominal leader. It's this Herod who is mentioned in the gospel about the death of John the Baptist, and he's the one that interrogates Jesus in Jerusalem just before the crucifixion. Pontius Pilate, he interrogates Jesus. He says, I find nothing wrong with him, but you know what? He's a Galilean, and Herod happens to be in Jerusalem at this time. Send him over here to Herod. I don't want to really have anything to do with this man. And Herod is the one, and we see in this icon here, that's Herod Antipas, who is interrogating Jesus. Yeah,
Is
Rebecca.
that the same Herod then when after Jesus and his mother Joseph were, they escaped to Egypt, they returned, and they said that they didn't go back, they went to, was it Nazareth?
Yes.
Is this that, because the Herod had died, that's why they decided to come back, but then his son was on the throne, so is it that same guy?
Yes. Yeah. And so that's why that's right. So they were a little leery of him as well, for good reason. And he's the one who had married Herodias, his brother's wife, and that's why Herod, John the Baptist says to him, "This is a no-no. You can't do that." And then Herodias, in her anger, tells her daughter, "You dance for Herod. He promised you something. I want the head of this John the Baptist right now." So these are all the players. This is where this is the people and the country from which Jesus Christ descended. The last thing I do want to talk about real briefly here, the religious feasts of the Jews, as we said, all of their feasts were connected with their history. So they had 4 great feasts. They had Passover, they call Pesach, we call Pascha in Greek, and that's the remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. The Feast of the Tabernacles is the remembrance of how the Jews wandered through the wilderness of Sinai for 40 years. And that was the feast during which the transfiguration of Jesus Christ occurred on the Mount Tabor. And that's why Peter says to him, Lord, should we put up 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah? Because it was during the Feast of the Tabernacles that occurred. And finally, the Feast of the Rededication of the Temple, as we said, that's Hanukkah, and that's when the Maccabean restoration of the temple. And then finally, the Feast of Pentecost, that was the other great feast of the Jews, and that was established in remembrance of how the people of Israel were given the law through Moses.
They call it Pentecost?
They called it Pentecost.
Ah.
And that corresponds exactly to our Pentecost, 50 days after the Passover, where we got the new law. The Holy Spirit comes down. You see the correlation there between the old law on Mount Sinai and the new law through the Holy Spirit.
Do they still celebrate these feasts? I know we all know they celebrate Hanukkah, but do they celebrate all these?
They Passover and Hanukkah they celebrate, and yes, I do. I think they still celebrate Sukkot and Shavuot. I think they still celebrate those. So yes, if you're a pious Jew now, you will celebrate all 4 feasts. That's all I have for today. Any other questions or comments?
Charlie.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey, was it too warm back there, Rick?
2 weeks from
Is
now.
it too warm back there?
Fine.
Was
Thanks
it?
for being here.
Let me sit open that window for the next time. Hey, Charlie, I was thinking that maybe. It was green all the way, but